Hi, this is 20 Minutes with a Titan. My name is Travis Lindsay. I'm a professor of entrepreneurship at Cal State Fullerton, manager of our Center for Entrepreneurship and CSUF Startup Incubator. And also, I'm an angel investor with a fund called Titan Angels. And today I'm here with Daniel Coates. Want to learn more about him, want to have a conversation with him. Daniel, tell me a little bit about yourself.
Hello, Travis. Hope you're having a great day. So I'm Daniel Coates, and I'm the marketing project coordinator for Cal State Fullerton's Mihaylo College of Business and Economics. I've been affiliated with Cal State Fullerton since 2013 when I first started taking classes here as an undergrad in communications. Since then, I've gone on to earn my undergrad degree and later my master's, both at Cal State Fullerton. And I've worked for the business college in a marketing capacity since 2014, so about 6 years now. In my pre-Fullerton days, I worked the stockroom of Nordstrom Rack, which was overnight and early morning work, and it was very hard work. And it was mostly at Ontario Mills, but I also helped them open their store at Riverside Plaza in Riverside, where I live. I've also done two internships. One was a group internship with 4 other students for the Environmental Nature Center in Newport Beach. We helped them with their annual Spring Fair event, which was one of the two big events they hold every year. And we helped them set up a social media strategy. And they've really expanded since then, partly because of the work we've done. They've set up a nature-based preschool program, and they've expanded their outreach in the community. And the second internship I did was an individual one with a new Chamber of Commerce in the Coachella Valley. And I helped them get started with having a media strategy and did a communication audit for them. In addition to those projects, I've also done historical archiving and research at the A.K. Smiley Public Library in Redlands in the Inland Empire. And that library has the only museum dedicated to Abraham Lincoln in the Western U.S. I also have a WordPress blog, Explore Southern Cal, where I share about places to visit here in Southern California. Southern California has a wealth of things to do and many interesting landscapes and cultural areas, and I just love checking out different parts of our area.
Yeah, so that's one of the things I respect about you is your passion for the outdoors and just nature in general. So how did that start with you? I mean, and how has it informed the other parts of your life, both personally and professionally?
Thank you for asking, Travis. So my interest in the outdoors started when I was 6, 7, and 8 years old in the Scouts program. I lived in the Inland Empire, and we would go to places in the San Bernardino and San Jacinto Mountains and the high desert. We do things like rocket launches at dry lakes, visiting Old West ghost towns, taking mountain hikes.
Now, wait a second. Rocket launches? Like, what are we talking about here?
Like little model rockets.
Okay. So,
And
like with like baking soda and stuff like that?
exactly. We go to places like there's a dry lake out near Ridgecrest, which is about 3 hours away from the Inland Empire, even further from LA and Orange County, called Cuddyback Lake, and that was the main place that we do that at.
Okay. And so one of the things that you do, among all the other things that you've already talked about, is that you do a lot of the writing, the copy, a lot of editing for marketing over at Mihaylo College here at CSUF. So what do you see as being your impact at CSUF?
So my impact at CSUF is it's relatively broad and it's grown over time. I do content for Mihaylo News, which is the college's official blog. And we cover stories about current students and their achievements. We cover alumni stories, reviews of faculty research, tips for students. I also help write, review, and plan the college's annual alumni magazine. And I help with various marketing projects needed in the college. And that could be anything from flyers and posters to brochures for events to tea signs and raffle cards for the college's annual golf tournament. And for a time, I was even doing some donor research for the college's development team. Most recently, I've had the opportunity to expand into helping out with the annual economic forecast. And that event is a chance for Cal State Fullerton's economists, Anil Puri and Mira Farka, to share about what's going on in the economy to business leaders, to fellow academics who study economics, even to government leaders and members of the media. Recently, I co-moderated the Q&A session of the Spring Economic Forecast, And that was a particularly important forecast because it looks at coronavirus and how it's impacting Southern California and what might be happening nationally and locally in the next 18 months.
Who was your co-moderator for that?
Morteza Ramadian, the dean of Mihaylo College.
Oh, okay. All right. Good guy. I
Yeah.
like him.
And
Entrepreneurs, business people in general are probably maybe listening to this and they're thinking, okay, well, this is great. This is what a college marketing team guy does. But what do you think entrepreneurs can learn from Mihaylo marketing in general?
Okay, so I work with a team called the marketing team, and we do content and marketing projects for the college. And we have a senior marketing strategist, we have a social media / photographer, we have a graphic designer, and then we have some student assistants who help out with all these functions. So it's a team of about a half dozen. And while we're working for the university itself, some of the dynamics that can carry over to entrepreneurship is we have a strong team network. We do regular meetings, usually in the office. Now it's by Zoom because of coronavirus, in which we discuss content leads and marketing projects. We make sure we share the load as much as possible and stay prioritized. We also have one administrative email account that we ask anyone with a project within the college to turn to and to reach out to. That helps us stay organized. And having a single point of contact is essential, in my opinion, for any business or operation. Unless you get big enough to have different departments, having that one contact really helps. And then as far as the content goes, we emphasize having content that's timely. I use a website called Days of the Year, which lists annual, unusual and lesser known observances and holidays. Things like today, May 5th, it's obviously Cinco de Mayo, but it's also National Astronaut Day, it's Asthma Day, it's Teacher Appreciation Day. And these type of days are great for content that will resonate. And you can also join a hashtag that others are using. Any one of those days has a hashtag. And so if you do any content related to that, obviously which one you'll choose probably depends on what type of business or operation you have. But latch onto one of those, do that on a semi-regular basis. That really helps to gain your exposure. Also, we found any type of content about pets and places to eat does really good. So if there's a way to incorporate that into your content, do it. Obviously, it has to stay focused on your mission, but something related to that, definitely, it's going to do well. And
yeah, it's got to be timely. It's got to be things that people are talking about. So you said it was National Astronaut Day?
Yep, it's National Astronaut Day today.
Well, they are probably safe from the pandemic, at least for the time being. So, kudos for them.
Yeah, and that could be an interesting story too, depending on what your niche would be. That could be something interesting to highlight, of how these might be some of the few people in the world who are like almost completely safe from the pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so
another suggestion I have about that too is do content about someone who others know. It could be someone who has a lot of LinkedIn or Facebook friends or connections. And that means that when you do content with them or about them, they're going to share the content, and it's a great way to build a following. And then having a really good photo, especially if you crop it rectangularly so it appears best on all the social media platforms, that does really good too. If you have a really high quality photo, people tend to really resonate with that. And it just makes your work look so professional.
Right. And you guys have done some video, right?
Yeah, we've done some video. Video's great. You have to take time to edit it, make sure it's really good, make sure it's good quality. Mm-hmm. But video is awesome. And if you do video, make sure you have a really good background. Even if you're interviewing someone, it could be a professional looking office. It could be something outdoors. You don't want something distracting. You want it to look really good.
Right. Yeah. So when I'm thinking of like an entrepreneur, and this isn't going to necessarily be a question, maybe it will be, but like I'm thinking of the small mom and pop shops. Obviously, they're hurting right now, but during normal times, even during normal times, they don't really have, or think that they don't have the time for social media marketing and getting the word out. And my advice is that it's just do what's sort of like what you guys are doing, have a plan and then, stick to it. So you guys have a content calendar, you work off of that. Everything is laid out. There's a system in place. There's processes for doing everything. So even, a one person or a small team that runs a florist shop, they could take pictures of the flowers and post those every day or a couple times a week. So there are definitely things that you can do. So I'm going to transition because I know that you are a student of history and you like learning about different stuff, especially current events and connecting them to history. And obviously the big story right now is the coronavirus and its response. What is your advice about that?
Okay, I'm not a medical professional, but I do have considerable knowledge about influenza pandemics. And there's two books I've read that have really formed the basis of that knowledge. One is called Influenza, the Last Great Plague by W.I.B. Beveridge. And I actually bought a used copy that was previously at the library of Massachusetts State Capitol. And it has that engraved on like the inside cover, which is really cool. And the other book is America's Forgotten Pandemic by Alfred Crosby, looking specifically at the 1918 Spanish flu. And a lot of this has a lot of relevance in relationship to coronavirus now. And in addition to studying it, I've also done some of my own primary research, reviewing the death records from Hillside Cemetery in Redlands, California from 1918 and 1919. And so I went through and I categorized those deaths as either related to Spanish flu or not. And that data is actually used by medical researchers at Loma Linda University or elsewhere. And though coronavirus isn't influenza, it's behaving a lot like pandemic flu, and I feel like it should be thought of that way. A pandemic flu occurs a few times per century. It's a new strain of flu that people's immune systems aren't ready for. So it causes a lot higher death rate and spreads a lot easier than regular flu. After a year or two, the pandemic ends, the severity becomes like a normal flu, but the new strain of flu becomes the dominant one until there's another pandemic. What's challenging in studying pandemics, though, is it's very hard to tell really how bad some of the flu pandemics were of the past, even some of the regular epidemics in non-pandemic years. Think of the 2017-18 season. Everybody agrees it was one of the worst non-pandemic years ever. But how bad was it? And that year I was actually on a nebulizer with flu symptoms at one point. But the CDC says 61,000 people died. Some estimates say 80,000 died. Some say a few tens of thousands. So which one's correct? Obviously, there's a big spread in that, and it depends on how it's categorized. But what everybody does agree on is that there were three pandemics in the 20th century. There was 1918 Spanish flu, 1957 Asian flu, and 1968 Hong Kong flu. And the one in 1918 was the most deadly. Best estimate is 670,000 deaths in the US or thereabouts, mostly during the months of September, October, November. 1957 was the second most deadly with 116,000 US deaths. And it might be similar to maybe what we'll see with coronavirus. So there's a lot to still be seen with it.
Yeah, and that one really hurt the economy as well. I was reading up on it, right? It knocked off like 10% of GDP growth, or it was more than that, maybe even. It was pretty substantial.
It may have. I think a lot more research should be done on that. And I actually encourage economists as well as historians to really delve into that, because 1957, that is a little bit more of modern times. It was definitely, the airplane, the car, the post-war economy was already in place by then. And there was a big recession called the Eisenhower recession that began in August 57, continued through April 58. Those were the same, that was the same period as that pandemic. And if you do some research on the recession, they don't say it's related to the pandemic. They say it was contractionary monetary policy. But you wonder, was there more of a connection to the pandemic than you might think, or than maybe we realize? And maybe if you look in retrospect, you might be able to find that more. I think
I mean, if you listen to a monetarist, monetary policy has a tremendous effect, and that's one of the hypotheses about why the Great Depression was so bad, because instead of expanding the money supply, they were contracting it. And so if they were doing the same thing in 57 or 58, that would have had a pretty bad effect on the economy.
That's true. And what's interesting with the 57-58 recession too, is it was in the middle of a time of very strong economic growth. From 1945 to about 1973, the US economy had 30 years of almost uninterrupted growth. That was the worst downturn in that period. But the economy did get back up quickly after that one, which is unusual. It was very much of like a V or U-shaped recovery. And that's what also makes me think how much of that had to do with the pandemic, because it seems like it was deep and then it was a quick upturn, which is not the norm with recessions.
Yeah. So I'm looking through your notes here, and even though you aren't a medical professional, you're not an epidemiologist, you're not a public health expert, correct?
No, not having any training in it.
So, I mean, it looks like you are hopeful that we're seeing the worst of the coronavirus right now. Is that accurate?
Yes, I'm hopeful that that would be true. I believe that pandemics typically have a couple of waves. However, there's one wave usually that's the really bad one. If you look at 1918, the bad wave was fall, September, October, November. There was a second wave that was kind of almost simultaneous in some areas. Some had like two distinct waves. Some it was just kind of one long wave. And the second one was spring of 1919. But it was really a 6-month period when the vast majority of death and illness occurred. You'll often hear that they'll say that spring of 1918 was the first wave and then came the really bad one in fall. But in spring of 1918, no one really knew that there was a pandemic. It was more in retrospect. People looked back and they figured out that flu that we had back in spring that seemed to have been related to the pandemic that we had in fall. What we're seeing right now is very severe in terms of mortality, in terms of the case fatality rate. Even if the rate is lower than what's being reported, it's still relatively high. So it makes me think this is the worst wave. Maybe we'll find out that there was a wave that happened earlier that we didn't realize, but I'm somewhat confident that we're in the worst of the wave right now.
Okay. So with that in mind, sorry for cutting you off there. I mean, we have a few minutes left, and I really wanted to get to this last question. I think it was late last year or early this year, you were trending on LinkedIn for some economic analysis that you posted, right?
Yeah, so what the first time that happened, what it was is I did a post in December of 2018 when there was a really good day in the stock market. It was in the middle of some stock market turbulence, and there was a day that was the best day in many years. And I thought, everybody knows what the worst days were. Nobody keeps track of what the best days were. And so I compared that with what are the best days in the history of the stock market. And I pointed out how in the middle of the Great Depression, there were some really good days where the market increased 10% or more in a single day. Yeah. And that post got picked up by the LinkedIn editors. And so it actually appeared on like anywhere in the world. If you went to linkedin.com and you went to the right sidebar where they have the stories, they had a story about the stock market jump. And that was one of the curated perspectives that they included.
So with your economic analysis bona fides substantiated, and just a point here, I think that some even better days have happened over the last few weeks for the stock market, but that's something we could talk about later. For the last couple of minutes of this interview, and we can go over a little bit, that's fine. I just want to pick your brain. Where do you think the economy is headed?
So I think that the stock market has risen out of a bear market low because investors are glad to see economic stimulus. They're glad to see the coronavirus is at least plateauing. They're glad to hear talk of reopening. But at some point, I think another correction or bear market's very likely as far as looking at the stock market side. When we're looking at unemployment rates exceeding 20% nationally, GDP declines of 30% or more, at least in this quarter, a lot of this has no precedent in U.S. history. Economic downturns of the past weren't anything close to how sharp this is. And even the economic declines that weren't nearly as sharp, the stock market went down a lot more. So I would anticipate that you're going to have an upswing, but as we start getting more data, there could easily be a downswing, at least on the stock market side. I've done some research looking at World Bank data And it examines the worst economic downturns in recent times. They've been keeping track of that since 1961. And I looked at nations that have had really big GDP declines. And I found that the worst one-year decline was Iraq in 91 during the Gulf War, where there was a 64% decline in GDP in a single year. As far as 2020, we don't know how bad it's going to be for the U.S.
Oh, wait a second. Is that true? Did the GDP for America decline by 64% in 91?
For Iraq, it did.
Oh, for Iraq, it did. Okay.
Yeah, in 1 year, 64%.
Okay, Iraqi. Okay, gotcha. Well, yeah, I mean, they kind of got, yeah.
But we don't know how bad 2020 will be for the U.S. GDP. But looking at least at the predictions of what the second quarter is going to be like, it seems to be in line with what Venezuela experienced last year, assuming if it did last for an entire year. Now, hopefully it doesn't last for a whole year. But what I find that's interesting is these really bad GDP declines that have happened in nations, they're often followed by the strongest GDP gains ever recorded in that country. Of course, it's a lot harder to make up for a GDP loss than it is to actually lose GDP in the first place. Like if you had a 50% decline in GDP in 1 year, it would take 7.5 years of growing at a 10% annual rate, which typically we think of that as a really good economy. It would take 7.5 years of that to make up for that 50% decline. But it does show that the worst economic years are usually followed by the best. And that's because these really bad economic conditions, not so much like where the economy is falling 5% of GDP year after year, that could be more of like a depression. But when you see countries that have had like 20% or more, 30% or more GDP declines in a single year, it's not really due to the economic cycle. It's due to other events. A lot of times it's wars or civil unrest, national breakups. Also, Ebola caused that in some parts of West Africa in 2014-15. And usually after you have such a big decline like that, there's a rush to rebuild once the worst of whatever emergency happens passes. And so I see that as a better precedent more than looking at the Great Depression or looking at like economic downturns that the US has faced. I'd look more at what some other countries have faced where they've had really big GDP declines. They're over a 1 year period though, and it's more because of a non-economic emergency.
Okay. So I'll put you on the spot. Where do you think we're going to be a year from now?
Economically?
Yeah.
I think a year from now, economically, I think there's going to be very high unemployment, at least high by American standards. The stock market probably won't be in a free fall. I don't know where it'll be, but I think it'll be somewhat stable. Like the volatility index or the VIX will probably be a lot more stable than it is even now. I think we will be in I would hope anyway that the first quarter of 2021 is a growth quarter, unless there's like a really big return of coronavirus or unless there's some other crisis like a political happening maybe that started because of coronavirus or unrest related to it or whatever. I would be somewhat hopeful that there's going to be growth in GDP, but I think it's going to be a longer recovery than people think. I think it's going to be a good year. Like 2021 could possibly be one of the best GDP years ever, but depending on how deep the GDP hole is this year, it's not going to mean very much. It's going to take a lot of years to get back to what we used to be at. And actually, 2021 will be a better year if 2020 is a worse year. Like right. if this quarter declines 30%, but the later quarters are better, then 2021 is going to be more like it might grow, but it might not be as strong. If all of 2020 has like a 30% GDP decline for the whole year, 2021 is going to have a lot bigger GDP gain.
Right. Yeah. Because the farther you fall, the higher you're going to bounce back up. I mean, that's the hope. My concern is always that employment is a lagging indicator for the economy. So during the last recession, GDP-wise, we returned to normal after a couple of years, or at least not normal, but the same level we were at before the recession. but employment took many years more to return to the same level as it was before.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm concerned about what's going on now. I have no freaking clue what's going to happen, but we shall see. All right, Daniel, that is all I have. Do you have anything else to add?
I'd love to talk a little bit more about travel in Southern California if you want to hear a little bit more, but I'm totally flexible on that.
Okay, if you could talk about travel in 90 seconds, let's do it.
Okay, so recently things have been different. Obviously, a lot of things have been closed because of coronavirus, but I've been spending a lot of time in that 3,000 to 6,000 foot altitude, which I think is my favorite altitude. I love the landscape in those places. I also feel a lot more better physically being in that altitude, and that's places like Victorville, Oak Glen, Wrightwood, Forest Falls, Lucerne Valley, Idlewild, Ortega Highway between Orange County and Lake Elsinore, places like that. The low humidity there is also great. I have less sinus and allergy issues, so that's really like my favorite climate and landscape. And the fire danger kind of scares me off from living on the west slopes of mountains, but maybe somewhere like Hesperia or Lucerne Valley or Julian, San Diego would be like a perfect environment for me, in my opinion. Recently, I've been to Hidden Valley in Riverside. It's kind of like a Great Plains prairie. The Santa Ana River Bridge in Highland, it's only open to pedestrians now, but it's a big steel bridge. Check that out sometime if you're in the area.
Yeah, that's the salad dressing place, right?
Where at?
Never mind, the Hidden Valley. It was, yeah. I'm sorry, go on.
Mormon Rocks in the Cajon Pass. It's a lot like Utah's national parks. It's hundreds of feet high rock formations. It's a little known gem because it's on the way to Las Vegas or other places, and people just drive through it and never stop by it. Waterman Canyon in San Bernardino. I've been up there recently. There's a trail that you can actually take from the side of the road called Cloudland Truck Trail. It has outstanding views of the natural arrowhead. It's a natural formation that looks just like an arrowhead. It's visible all through the San Bernardino Valley, and you can see that up close from there. You can also see for miles and miles away if it's a clear day. Probably the most beautiful place I've been this spring, though, is Jackson Lake near Wrightwood. It was my first time in the Wrightwood area, and I did know how to get there. You definitely need to know how to get to Wrightwood, because if you don't get to Wrightwood correctly, you wouldn't be in Wrightwood, you'd be in Wrongwood. But it's one of the most beautiful places I've ever seen. There was snow melting, but it was in the 60s. And it was like, the lake itself was like a beautiful spring day there, but just like literally a few hundred feet above, there was snow. And it was a picture perfect place. It's hard to believe that's actually LA County, but it's part of the Angeles National Forest. If you live anywhere near LA, you have to see the Angeles National Forest. It's really a stunning place.
Very good. I think we'll leave it at that. And, once the stay-at-home order lifts, we're going to have to go up there and do a hike. I mean, it'll be a short hike because I hate hiking, but, we could, look at the place. So that'd be cool.
Yeah, definitely. It's an awesome place. And,
all right. Thank you very much. But I'm sorry, did you have something else to say?
I was just going to say that hiking, even with social distancing, you have to plan things. Obviously, you want to stay away from other people and keep your distance. But hiking is one of the best things you can be doing right now. It's a great way to stay physically active. It's a great way to stay fit, and it's a great way to stay focused on beautiful things and enjoying nature and enjoying how lovely our world is.
I hear that. That's a good note to leave it on. So thank you very much, Daniel. This has been 20 Minutes with the Titan. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for having me, Travis.
All right. Thank you, buddy.